Okay, good evening. Tonight we are going to shift. We're going to go a little bit back in time. We've finished the Golden Age of Spain. We've concluded basically with the Rambam died in 1204. It's going to be his 820th yard site around Hanukkah time. A number of years ago, 24 years ago, 20 years ago, they did a whole thing around the world for the 800th yard site of the Rambam. In any case, and we saw the amazing things that took place in Spain and in that part of the world, which gave it the name the Golden Age of Spain, both in terms of philosophy, art, in terms of the
Hello?
yes.
Sorry.
It's okay. You hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. I forgot to change something here. I've got to pin myself here. Okay. Here, do this. Keep it. There we go. Okay, no, it's fine. It's all friends here. And the growth of grammar, people who were into grammar, the writing of poetry and piyutim and just the explosion that to this day we still benefit from, especially from the halachic works, the philosophy works, and like I say, the grammar works, and Ibn Ezra and all these other people we talked about, which kind of begs the question, that's the Sephardi world. What about the Ashkenazi world? And for sure, in that time period, and even after it, we don't see that kind of growth at all when it comes to the areas of grammar. We don't see it in areas of piyutim, liturgical poetry, regular poetry. We don't see it in the deep works of philosophy. There's just like this big, huge difference. So what we're going to do, I'm going to show you a slide. We are going to start the Crusader period with an introduction from Modi. Now, for those of you who don't know who Modi is, he's a comic. He's a Jewish guy. He's a comedian. He's a former Chassid. He is no longer religious. His comedy, for the most part, is very good. And he has some very brief points. He does a whole bunch of them when he shows differences between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. And I'm going to show two of them, and afterwards I'll explain why I'm showing them. Okay, so here's the first one. Let me turn the volume up.
Sephardic men go up.
I have to go back to the beginning of it. Okay.
Sephardic men go up. They get that Torah blast. They come off. What do you say? Chazaku Baruch. Strong and blessed. And they hug everyone. Chazaku Baruch. They take their towels. COVID. Chazaku Baruch. An Ashkenazi guy comes off in Aliyah, looks like he just had a stroke. And what did we say? Shkaya.
With this one.
Give me a good Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Peaceful Shabbat Shalom. They give it to you with all they're from here. Shabbat Shalom. They almost command you to have a peaceful Sabbath. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Aleichem ve'al kol b'nechem u'me'al kol b'nei Shabbat Shalom. They give it to you. It's passion. Ashkenazi Jews before the Sabbath. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. How are you? Okay, good.
Okay, so why in the world did I start a very serious topic, which is the Crusades, with these two brief comedy pieces? Because it really paints a huge difference between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi world, that didn't happen in a vacuum. We have to understand when we talk about customs, we talk about mores, when we talk about philosophy, when we talk about religion, all these things that go into who we are, nothing happened in a vacuum. I'll give you one example, because Baruch Hashem, I have a lot of experience with this. The differences between, just talk about the Shoshana Yom Kippur, the difference between the Ashkenazi world and the Sfaradi world, or Slichot, Ashkenazim, Sfaradi. By the Ashkenazi world, you have a lot of oyoyois, and by the Sfaradi world, you have singing, almost everything, including when we sing Chatanu. Chatanu, Chatanu lefanecha. We sing before, we sing that. How does that happen? How did these different approaches and philosophies of not just life, but religion and the way we relate to Hashem and how we relate to each other, how we relate to so many things in life, how did that change? How did they diverge like that? So again, within the Sfaradi world, we just finished in the Golden Age of Spain, we saw the joy, and we saw the writings and the philosophy and the Torah growth and all these things. So we're going to shift now. I could just start and simply say, okay, now we're going to talk about Rashi. We're going to talk about Balet, Tosafot, and all these people. But again, it leaves out it's talking about the body, but you're leaving out the soul. To understand who Rashi was and the time period he lived in, and the century or two after him, to understand that, you have to understand what was going on that led to this. And that's the time period of the Crusades. Why is it? First, probably the simplest, easiest answer to start off with to the question of how did these two types of communities, these two types of Jews, grow so differently, has to do with the surroundings of these people. Spain was as we saw, was very developed, highly cultured for hundreds and hundreds of years. It allowed the Jews to live in some form of peace for the most part. Sometimes they were deemed like second-class citizens. But they still had a lot of rights. They didn't have to constantly be running for their lives. And it gave centuries of time, literally centuries of time, for to be an incubator for these types of events. We talked about the fact that how was the Ibn Ezra influenced in his world of writing when it came to PUT, when it came to liturgical poetry, because that was what was very popular in the non-Jewish world and by the Muslims and others. So there's all this feeding in. But in Christian Europe, the Jews did not have the centuries upon centuries of mental peace and quiet. Almost never. There were certain areas in Provence and parts of France that did have more peaceful years than many other parts of Europe. But for the most part, even in Germany at that time of history, the suffering wasn't so bad for the Jews in general. They did produce some very serious Jews. It did produce a lot of loyalty to the religion. And what happened was there was also a lot of martyrdom, which we'll talk about. I came across a very interesting, I've only seen it a couple places, but I thought it was very interesting play on words, if you want to say that. We just talked about the Golden Age of Spain. So there is no Golden Age in the Ashkenazi world. What they had was the Iron Age. Why was it called the Iron Age? I only saw this in a couple of history books. Because they lived under the iron of the sword. Because it was a lot of their experience, a lot of there's a historical memory of the Ashkenazi world is the living under what we call today the gun, but then under the sword. And if you think that doesn't have a long-term effect, look right now at some of the discussions, let's say it like that, in the public sphere here in Israel. I'm not going back right now to the time of the Crusades. Let's jump ahead to the times of the 1800s and the shtetls and Europe and the Tsar and the pogroms and all that. Again, they say in Hebrew, a story that just kind of repeats itself. Let's just jump ahead a few hundred years. and the philosophy and the mental attitude towards the government. And you talk about, for example, you'll find some communities where if the police are the enemy, because the police represent the government, and the government is the czar. The idea of calling somebody to talk with, if you have, there are certain communities in which if there's a person who is a child abuser, you wouldn't want to report him because that's called being a moser. A moser literally means handing over. There's halacha that says that you cannot hand over a fellow Jew to a government that could torture or kill without any laws. So in the time of the czar, you'd be a moser. But they still say today, you want to hand over someone who's in your community who's a child abuser, you do that, you're a moser. And you can't do that. So it's, again, the past influences the present, and it becomes part of the DNA of the community, just like the golden age of Spain and the growth and all those things I mentioned already before became part and parcel of the growth of Sephardi Jewry, the suffering and living literally under the sword, which we're going to talk about starting tonight with the Crusades, informed who the Ashkenazi community and what the Ashkenazi community became. I mean, again, the whole idea, again, going back to our Shine, the right? And the kretching and the kvetching, it just didn't happen in a vacuum. And at some point, we're going to talk about that, maybe even before Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. So let's start talking now about what's known as the cross and the sword. It's called the Crusades. Crusades, called the Crusades, called the Crusaders. It's called the Christian Crusades. In Hebrew, it's called the Tzalbanim, Tzali Lamed Bet Nun Yud Mem Sofit, from the word Slav. Slav is a cross. So Tzalbanim are those who walked with the cross. How did this come about? The church, for a number of centuries, was in the middle of an identity crisis. They didn't have as much power as they sought to have, until a man named Pope Urban II came around. And he made a declaration that was as follows. We need, at that time, Israel was known still as Palestine, not the pretend Palestine we're talking in the media about, but the real Palestine. And it was inhabited mostly by Muslims. Remember that because Jesus was a Jew, and because he lived in Bethlehem and all this other stuff that went with the Christian history, Jerusalem itself is holy to them, and other cities are holy to them. And it was anathema to them that these people, they called them Mohammedism, whatever they call it, but even Muslims were living there. And Pope Urban II, along with a man named Godfrey de Bouillon, in 1095 declared, and in 1096 began what became known as the First Crusade. What was the First Crusade to do? To go and redeem the Holy Land, which meant they were going to go from Europe. And I'll show you a few maps after I'm going to talk to many, many crusades. I'm just going to talk about maybe 2 or 3 of them. And then I'll show you some maps just so you get a visual. I found a website that had some really good information. But it was the idea of going to the Holy Land, which they referred to Israel, the Holy Land, to rid it of the Muslims who were there and replant the Holy Roman or the Roman Catholic Church in the land of Israel by getting rid of them. And they were going to fight the battle of Christianity. Now, you can't just tell people, let's go back way, way, way back in history. Beginning in Parshat Shemot, we know that Paro wants to kill the Jews, right? He wants to kill, you see his Itztagdinim, his astrologers tell him that there's going to be a Moshiach, there's going to be a savior is going to come and is going to take the Jews out. So he tells that he has to have all the baby boys killed. Well, you can't just tell what was at that time a very progressive, it was the powerhouse of the world at the time, go kill all the babies. There had to be reason. You had to give them a reason to do it. And they said, and Paro gives reasons, and they say, yeah, we're on it. Same thing happens here. That says as follows: what is it going to be that the Pope is going to tell the people that if they go to the Holy Land and kill the Muslims and they settle there, what is it going to be their reward? So it absolute guarantee to heaven. The Pope guaranteed anyone who goes to battle, and especially if they fall in battle, in the defense, in the freeing of the Holy Land from the defiled Muslims, that every person would have a share in paradise. Boy, where have we heard that before? Let's think about that. So the Muslims believe if they kill a Jew and or they get killed by a Jew, then they go and they become a shaheed, which means a martyr, and they go to heaven and they get 72 virgins. They're going to be very surprised. That's all I can say. Very, very surprised. So what happens is that there's this emotional movement that it became like, not everyone, remember, it's not like today we have internet, you can see everything's going on anywhere in the world. The idea that the Holy Land was occupied by the Muslims and they were defiling the land, they get all worked up and they said that we need to go there. We need to rid the land of Muslims. We need to conquer the land. We need to bring Christianity there, bring to glory to the name of the J-man. And there were different motivators, let's say, depending on the caste level you were in. If you were a landowner, you were a rich man, you were a nobleman, one of the reasons you wanted this is because you're going to get more land and you're going to make more money. They couldn't care less about the heavenly reward. But when it came to the idea of the serfs and remember, there's a feudal system, the serfs and the peasants, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, just basically it's the top tier, lower, middle, and the bottom, like the grunts. Again, like the upper class, middle class, lower class. So the ordinary crusaders, in quotes, they were the serfs and the peasants and the bottom of the food chain, and they felt there was a chance for adventure. Yeah, we're going to get, maybe we'll get this reward of paradise. That's great, but it's an adventure. Lahavdil, lahavdil, lahavdil. If you ever read The Hobbit, you'll understand a little bit about how the Baggins family hates adventure and how he does go on this adventure. And they're seeing now that they're going to start to go on this reward-based trip. The guys who are already rich will get richer. The guys at the bottom of the barrel are going to have an adventure. Everyone's going to get a place in paradise. The Pope, after all, the Pope promised. Problem was, it was a very disorganized event, the first crusade. And they were unrestrained, and it was not, they didn't have proper leadership. That's good, I guess, in some respects. But while in the middle of this first crusade, again, they're going to basically, here, I'll just show you the first map and I'll tell you the problem with it. Let's go to here. I'm going to move me and you guys over here. I'm going to make this bigger. You'll see this map here. So this from Europe, from France, from here, from the area of Vienna, there, and Rome especially, Constantinople, which we know changes names in the future. And they're going here into the land of Israel, Antioch, Akko, Jerusalem. The eventual, and we're going to see if we get to it tonight, some fascinating maps. How can a map be fascinating? We'll see. Eventually to Jerusalem. This is the first crusade. You'll look at the key here. This whole area is the Holy Roman Empire. This is the Christian territory. I've heard many times, I've said this in this class too, that I've heard before, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Okay. Then you had Muslim territory, which over here, down over here, here. And then the Crusader states end up here. The Crusaders end up taking over this area here. And that's in the first crusade. But what was the problem that we had? I'm going to leave this up here because I'm going to go to a couple more maps in a minute. They realized that, wait a second, we are here, right? We're here in Europe. Here we're in France, we're in Italy, we're in other parts of the Byzantine Empire over here. But between here, we're in Europe, and here in the Holy Land, remember, the goal is to get the Holy Land freed from the Muslims. We have a problem that between here and here, there's lots and lots of Jews. And you know what? The Muslims are defiling the land of Israel, or really the Holy Land is what they refer to it as. But the Jews, they're the, so to speak, Christ killers. They don't hold our values. They don't believe in the J-man. We need to rid us ourselves of them as well. And by the way, by doing that, we get all their money, because the Jews were, many of the Jews were very wealthy at this time period of history in Europe. So in a sense, they got, pardon the expression, like a double mitzvah. They kill a Jew, and they're also doing it for the sake of their God, and they get a reward for their soul. And it was just, you couldn't lose this on this one. Many persecutions began as a result of this first crusade. The I guess you'd call it the problem for the Christians was, how do you keep the momentum going? Okay, how do you keep this going? Because this ends up, the Crusades go over a period of centuries. And there's, by the way, there's so much to talk about this time period that I'm not going to do. This could be literally months just talking about the Crusades. I know people who've done their master's and their doctorate just on the topic of Crusades, and very narrow section of it as well. Because I'm just trying to get this to understand what's going on for the Jews during this time period, and we haven't really barely touched on it except for this one point. So there is an area that some of the Jews believe that even though things are bad around other parts of Europe, by them it's not so bad. Now I want you to keep that in mind for a second, that some of the Jews, whether it was the Jews of France, the Jews of Germany, they felt that they weren't really in danger. Keep that in mind, so that whenever we get to the topic of the Holocaust, how that self-perpetuating idea that it's not about us, it's never going to happen to us, to the point where the Hungarian Jewry were the last korbanot of the Shoah, where they said, no way, we're Hungarians before we're Jews. This is, again, that was nothing new. This is already happening in the 11th century and into the 12th century, where the Jews believed they would be okay. And not only they felt they would be okay, they had reason to believe that, which was that some of their Christian neighbors said, we'll help you, we'll protect you, we'll hide you. And whom did they turn to, actually? The Jews turned to also the nobility, the local nobility, in some cases, some of the local bishops, meaning within the church itself, because evidently some Jews in some communities with some of the church had decent relationship. At least it seems that way. And they felt that they were promised that they would be protected. Remember, protected by when they were going to be going from Europe towards the Holy Land and killing Jews along the way. Okay, that's at least what they believed. Came the Chag of Shavuot, and there were Crusaders who were about to embark to the Holy Land, decided to make a little bit of a stop. Let me see if I have it on this map or it's the next one. Hold on one second. Here, this is what I was going to look for. Okay, they make a stop in Germany, and they go to three communities. They go to many communities, but three that I'm going to mention briefly, which is Mainz, Worms, Rashi's home, Speyer. Now, if it might sound somewhat familiar to these names. Why might it sound familiar, you ask yourselves? We just had Tisha B'Av a couple weeks ago. Hard to believe, it's been a couple weeks already. And there are at least a couple of keynotes that are written specifically about the Crusaders having destroyed Speyer, Mainz, and Vermisa, or Vermisa, just for different pronunciations. Worms, Mainz, and Speyer, where the Crusaders came through, and these Jews who in these communities felt they were protected, they had some protection from the church, both for themselves and their stuff, were unfortunately sadly mistaken. And there were a lot of people that were slaughtered in those communities. In these others too that you see in this Mannheim and Strasbourg below, and Cologne, Germany, and Heidelberg, and some of these names unfortunately will repeat themselves in World War II just a few hundred years later. But specifically Jews of Speyer, Mainz, and Worms. And also, and by the way, Mainz is Magenza. For those of you, for anyone you know, the name has Magenzi as a name, Magenza. It comes from Mainz in Germany, generally speaking. So no longer are the Jews safe there, because when push came to shove, the Christians sided with the Christians. They felt like, well, we could hide them, we could help them with their stuff, we could help with their person. But again, they may have been sorry to see them suffer, but they had to take themselves into consideration first. The Jews defended themselves. Unfortunately, it was helpless. And one of the things that happened in this crusade, again, this is still the first crusade, was in one of these communities. I forgot which one. Let me see if I have it in my nose. Just a minute. It's when they actually got to the city of Jerusalem. In this first crusade, when they finally got to the city of Yerushalayim itself, and there were Jews there, they took Jews to a building, put them in the building, and burned it to the ground with the Jews in it. There's a city in Poland called Jedwabne. It's spelled Jedwabne, but it's pronounced Jedwabne. The city in Jedwabne, there was a very small book written many years ago. It's at least 20 years. A book called Neighbors, written by a man named Jan Gross, spelled Jan, Jan Gross. And I was on a trip to Poland many years ago, and one of the things we were told to read was the book Neighbors. And it was about the city of Jedwabne, where the Jews, and there's a reason I'm telling you this right now, because it fits in exactly what we're talking about here. The Jews lived in this Polish town of Jedwabne. They got along with their Polish neighbors. And when the Nazis come into the German Nazis from Germany come into Poland, and they're now planting themselves in various cities. They were right there by Jedwabne. But the Germans are not the ones who ended slaughtering all the Jews in the city of Jedwabne. It was the Poles. It was their own neighbors, the one that said they're going to protect them and watch over them. And what they did specifically is they put them into a huge barn that was there, locked the doors, lit it on fire, and burned the Jewish community, literally burned them to death. When I was there, I was able to see, you don't see the actual remains of the barn, but you see the exact spot where it stood, and the Jews were martyred in this place. And again, why am I telling this? Because once again, something that happened in 1096 happens again in I'm going to make up a year, 1941, 1942. I can't tell you exactly the year. I don't remember off the top of my head. But it's again the story that repeats itself. So when we're talking here about the first crusade and the second crusade, the third crusade, and many, many other crusades, nothing gets reinvented. Nothing is created new in World War II that didn't really happen before, with probably the biggest exception, of course, is the gas chambers. Even the mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, which we'll learn about. Already there are things like this that are already happening centuries before. So that's the first crusade. Nice people. Second crusade was a little bit different. After the first crusade is finished, there's an attempt to try to bring some normalcy back into fashion. Let me just take this off the screen. But it's still stuck in the minds of the Christians, because again, this is the church pushing this agenda, that to kill a Jew was pleasing to God. It's bad enough when you say, kill somebody because you don't like them, kill somebody because they're no good. But when you insert the religion into it, what happens is, like by Muslim terrorists, it's the same idea. They're not doing it just because they want to kill a Jew. They're doing it out of fervor. They're doing it out of love for Allah. They're doing that, whatever it might be, but it's all based on belief in a religion, the culture of death. So even though the first crusade is already over for a number of years, the mindset is still there. And in the year, let me have it written down here, 1144, the second crusade is preached. And the idea of what should happen in the second crusade, again, now they're a little bit more organized. They're making their way through Jewish communities in an organized fashion. They're making their way to Israel, to the Holy Land, in an organized fashion. They set up things there that I'm not going to discuss tonight, but next time we talk about the next class, which will be a little bit down the road, There were what were called the Knights Hospitaller. There were the Knights Templar. They had different purposes when they came ahead of the Crusades. The people were there specifically to set up hospitals. They're there to set up their churches. They're set like to prepare the way for their attackers when they finally land here, so to speak, and they finish their job of killing as many Muslims and Jews as they could. Then they had an infrastructure ready to go for them, and that's already happening in the Second Crusade. Third Crusade will be the last one I will talk about. Is in 1189. So now we're only about 40 years after the Second Crusade. They needed very little pretext because already now we're talking since 1096. This is 100 and it's about 100 years now since the beginning of the First Crusade, a little bit less. And this is specifically a crusade that happened for the most part against the Jews of York in England. What happened? There was a king whose name you know, Richard the Lionhearted, became king. And when he became king, London, somehow there was what we call today fake news that Richard the Lionhearted promised that right after his coronation, he was going to lead another crusade, and he was calling on people to join him in this new crusade. And that rumor spread very quickly. And that the rumor was that the king had not only approved, but was encouraging people to kill Jews. He himself went on, I would say on TV, but he went to the public square and he announced it's fake news. It's not true. And a matter of fact, I'm saying that if someone who does it, they go to kill the Jews, they'll be put to death. And he forbade, I don't know how you say it, anybody from molesting, from hurting, killing the Jews. But people don't necessarily like to hear something that contradicts that which they already believe. And some riots started to break out after Richard the Lionhearted leaves London. And they specifically target the Jews of York, where there's a serious pogrom, serious killing of many, many Jews. Homes were pillaged. The Jews had almost no weaponry. Interestingly enough, there were many who decided on suicide, die rather than being taken captive. There's a story in the Gemara about something like that. There's the story of Masada, which may or may not be accurate. Interestingly, one day maybe we'll talk about that. There's the city up north of Gamla, where there's a similar story of mass suicide. I'm not talking about Jim Jones and Kool-Aid. I'm talking because they didn't want to be taken captive and be abused by their captors. There were some Jews who decided to be baptized because that was one way out. There are Shelot and Shuvot, Jewish responsa throughout the centuries of whether someone is allowed to convert, quote unquote, even just outwardly, not internally in their mind, in their heart, to save their lives. Most come out saying, no, you cannot do that, because that falls into the category of one of the three big things that we do not allow ourselves to do. We would be killed rather than do them. But interestingly enough, also, specifically in York, what happened was one of the motivations for killing the Jews was not just religious. Remember, the Jews had money still, even 100 years after the first crusade. And what did the Jews do with their money? They're money lenders. Okay, we know stories throughout the century. The Jews were money lenders. And they kept meticulous records, and the records are kept in the church. So what happened? Kill a Jew, you burn the records, you don't owe anybody any money. So if I owed some, if I'm Mr. Joe Christian and I owe some Jew 10,000 whatever, some guy's shekel, and he's dead, and there's no records of it, I just saved myself $10,000. I got 10,000 shekel for free. So that's, again, another part of the issue of what was really motivating these people in order to proceed with the Crusaders. Now, before we start to investigate, we will do that only next time probably, before we start to investigate what exactly was how does this affect the Jews? I mean, the obvious way it affected the Jews is death. Okay, but there are many other things that were involved in this whole thing. How did now I started off this class tonight talking about how there was this tremendous growth in the Spanish world, in the Sfaradi world, of authors and of philosophy and poetry and all that, and not so in the Ashkenazi world. I really haven't answered that yet. We won't really get into that too much tonight. But one of the things that did happen at this time, and I want to talk about this for a few minutes. Let me make this small here. There, okay. One of the things that happened is that in Europe, in many cities, Jews are told, not this isn't Europe, obviously. Jews are, I mean, this isn't that time period. This is World War II. Jews are told they had to wear certain identification clothing. So, you know, some people think that the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, came up with the idea of putting a yellow star on people, on Jews to identify them. So let's take a look at a couple of historical things. This is the proclamation that Jews had to wear specific hats. You'll find some old manuscripts. These are the Christians over here, and you'll notice this headdress represented many of the people went on the Crusades, and the king over here is declaring that the Jews have to wear special headdress. In addition to that, you had a marking they had to wear. You'll notice what it looks like. It wasn't a Magen David. It was the Luchot. They were told they had to wear this, and otherwise they would get beaten. This is one of, we have a few pictures of this. Go to here. Just different representations, different centuries, different wars, different crusades, whether it was Jude, this is the Dutch, there's French Juif, Jude for German, here they are here wearing them. It didn't start in World War II. It didn't start with the Nazis. It happened hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, centuries earlier. What they did do differently, the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, was branding people and making them into numbers. You know that I was born and raised in Chicago. I learned in yeshiva there in Chicago, Hebrew Theological College. Now it's called the Fossman Yeshiva High School. There was a project that the student body did this past year. I think they did it once again in the past, but this year, right before Tisha B'Av, it was I watched on Tisha B'Av. It was called Names, Not Numbers, and the idea was that they interviewed a number of the different people who went through the Holocaust with specific questions about different topics, and all these people, instead of being just a number, to make them a name and personalizing a handful of stories. It is fantastic. It was perfect for Tisha B'Av to watch. And so this is something the Nazis definitely did differently than prior generations that wanted to kill Jews. The identification, not just they were Jews, but identification to dehumanize them, which is a topic obviously we'll have to talk about at some point. We come down to here. I want to show you this. Okay. This I have out of a book. I want to thank Adam Berger, who loaned me a number of books to look at. And in this, make it a little bigger, and I mentioned to you about maps before. Let's see. Cancel. Okay. I can make this. So in this book that he gave me, I'm not going to, the point is not the detail. The point is the picture right now. You'll notice these maps of Jerusalem. Remember, the ultimate goal was freeing Jerusalem from the Muslims and from the Jews to get them out of there. And interestingly enough, all the maps that were drawn in this time period by the church, by the Crusaders, by the cartographers of the time, showed Jerusalem in the round. It was a representation. Now, we will talk about a different time what were the different things within these pictures, what they set up, and what we now call the Old City, some places outside the Old City. Again, you know that throughout the country, from the time of the Crusaders, you can't go on a teal anywhere in this country. Oh, here's an old Crusader fortress, or here's a Crusader fortress, or here's a Crusader from the Knights Templar, whatever it might be. So we'll talk about those buildings. But what was the reason that the map of Jerusalem was always in a circle? I say because the point being was no matter where you were in the world, This was the center. This was the focus. Gee, I wonder where they got that idea. Okay, again, the same idea that the Christians have done for centuries, whether it's baptism or any other of these things in Islam, is also borrowed much from the Jews, that this is a visual representation of what it meant, what Jerusalem meant to them, and why they were trying specifically to redeem the land. Let me take off screen share. And I'm going to stop the recording here. I'm not finishing, but I'm stopping the recording.